Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
The counting is over, and Kamala Harris is the first woman, the first African American, and the first Indian American Attorney General of California. The new and powerful Redistricting Commission started work this week and will remap California's political landscape. The United States Supreme Court takes up the issue of California's overcrowded prisons. Meanwhile, inmates are being transferred to private prisons in other states. And an exhibition of the life and work of Bay Area painter Bernard Zakheim is at the Jazz Heritage Center in San Francisco. We'll have those stories next. Good evening and welcome to This Week in Northern California. I'm Barbara Rogers, sitting in for Belva Davis. Joining me tonight on our news panel are Josh Richmond, political and legal affairs reporter with the Oakland Tribune, Lisa Vorderbruggen, political editor for the Contra Costa Times, and Marisa Lagos, political reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. And we'll start with you, Marisa. And it's Lagos, and I'll get that right as the night goes on. We're going to start with you talking about Kamala Harris's election. It took us a long time to find out who was going to be the next Attorney General. Now that we know we've got all these firsts for her, what are we likely to see coming from her as Attorney General?
Well, when she finally claimed victory this Tuesday, almost a full month after the election, we heard her talk a lot about the environment, something she had talked on the campaign trail. She talked a lot about something she hadn't talked as much about when she was campaigning, which is really making sure that she is the Attorney General for the whole state. And she talked a lot about going to counties, suburban, rural, and urban, making sure they have the resources they need to really do the jobs. We can expect her not to defend Prop 8 in court, the same-sex marriage initiative. And I think we can expect to see at least her trying to do something about the state's recidivism rate, although, that's really going to be more of sort of her pushing policies rather than taking concrete action.
One of the things that she talked a lot about in her campaign was all of the things that she had done to sort of revamp the whole prison system or the jail system in terms of people going back and forth. Are we likely to see her try to expand that to the state level?
I think so. One of the things, her program is called Back on Track, and it's something that really takes low-level first-time offenders and tries to get them the tools they need to stay out of trouble in the future. Again, that's something she's going to be going to individual counties and district attorneys around the state and kind of talking to them about how they can institute similar programs. So I think we will see leadership. I mean, I think one of the sort of misunderstandings among voters is really what the Attorney General does. She will have a role in court. They do defend, lawsuits against the state, death penalty appeals, but a lot of it is more policy related and things like we've seen Jerry Brown do, going out and, suing government agencies or private industry when he sees environmental violations, things like that. So, and then there's also the political stuff. She gets to write the ballot summaries and arguments. Those are going to be, as usual, I'm sure, things that folks on the other side of the aisle have problems with.
And she's also, when you're talking about leadership, she's also a star as, one of the up-and-comers in the Democratic Party. How likely is that going to be to overshadow her job as Attorney General, or will it be a big help?
Probably a little of both. I mean, this is going to really raise her profile. She's already sort of well known for supporting President Obama far earlier than a lot of folks. So I think that that's going to be both a help and hindrance depending on who you talk to. Her critics have always charged in San Francisco that she's more worried about sort of the next step and what people think of her than doing the job at hand. That said, California is the 8th largest economy in the world. We have a lot of pull over sort of national policies when it comes to things like the environment and things like that.
What kind of communication and synergy does she seem to have with the outgoing Attorney General, our new Governor, Jerry Brown?
It sounds like they've been talking a lot. I think that, they both come from the same region, from same sort of backgrounds when you think about politically. So I would expect them to work very closely together. I wouldn't expect her to toe the line on every single one of his initiatives, but I think that is going to certainly help both of them. And, you know, she'll be up there also with Lieutenant Governor-elect Gavin Newsom, which there's another twist here in San Francisco where we have both a mayor and a DA who are leaving, and that'll be an interesting fight locally.
Any thoughts on who might be the new DA?
Well, there's a number of people who have expressed interest in being elected. Nobody's willing to say they want to be appointed, but we have former police commissioner David Onick, who teaches at UC Berkeley. Former prosecutor Jim Hammer would certainly love the spot. David Chu, the president of the board's name has been thrown around. Catherine Feinstein, a judge who is also Senator Feinstein's daughter. It's going to be an interesting month. I think it's really up in the air at this point.
What is the sort of the conventional wisdom about how Kamala Harris pulled this victory off? I mean, it was thought that Steve Cooley had the edge, being, you know, from LA, and she managed to trump him. How did she do that?
Well, yeah, as you noted, we should probably say this was a 75,000 vote margin at the end of this, and there was 9.4 or something million votes cast in this race, so really tiny. I think it was a confluence of factors. I think she campaigned really hard, and I don't think anybody should take away the hard work. She raised a lot of money. She was all over, especially in LA. But this was a bad year for Republicans in California. He did get more votes than any other statewide GOP candidate. So I think that was a big part of it. And, you know, I'm not sure that he really got out there and connected with voters the same way she did.
This was the first time he had to run with an R next to his name as opposed to as a nonpartisan office of district attorney down there, too.
Absolutely. And, you know, I don't think he was used to that. And I don't think he was, quite frankly, used to campaigning as hard as somebody like Kamala Harris was. And, you know, she worked hard, and he definitely got dragged down by the Republicans.
All right. Well, thank you, Marisa. We'll be watching because I'm sure whatever she does is going to be interesting for all of us. Well, Lisa, you have been looking at some interesting people and the new Redistricting Commission. First of all, I think a lot of people don't even know who they are and what they do. So why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about the commission?
Well, the California Independent Redistricting Commission, and surprisingly enough, a lot of voters actually do know what the Redistricting Commission is because they voted on it so many darn times in the last few years and to create it and to expand it with Proposition 20 to include Congress. And what it is it's going to be eventually a group of 14 individuals who will draw 120 legislative districts and 4 Board of Equalization districts, 53 congressional districts. They must do it by August 15th of next year, based on April 1st census data that will come out, you know, after the first of the year. So
now, some of those commissioners are already there, but there's a little bit of controversy about whether the ones who are there are representative enough of the actual voters in California. And then there are some more that need to be picked, correct?
Yes, we have 8 of the commissioners have been selected through a very convoluted process that began with 30,000 applications. 30,000 people put in their name to be on the Redistricting Commission. So at least 30,000 people knew. Yeah, there is, you know, you would think, you know,
or something?
there is a small stipend that goes with it. You know, when you're serving there, you'll be paid per day, I believe. And so when you're working at it full time, I believe it will be enough to get by on when you do that. And
how do those how many more are going to be selected?
There need to be 6 more selected. And right now, of course, the argument is, you know, are they from a diverse enough ethnic background, racial background, geographic background? Right now, there are more women than men. Right now, there are more people from Northern California than Southern California. There are 4 Asian Americans on this 8 that were drawn randomly from a pool, and the population, you know, in California is about 13% Asian Americans, so they're overrepresented at this point. And you know, there's no one from the LA city proper on the remaining in the pool to be selected. So by the end of the month, the 8 folks who are there now will select the other 6, and they have no direct requirement for how they're to pick them other than they need to consider sort of the racial, economic, and geographic split.
Isn't some of this concern, though, about the diversity of it a little bit premature, considering these were the random picks, and now there can be some more selective picks made to sort of balance things out?
Correct. They can pick from the others, and they know everything about these people. And you know, one thing that does strike me is that these individuals have been private individuals. I mean, the chairperson is a gentleman by the name of Mr. Yao. He's from Claremont, down in Southern California. He's an outgoing city councilman there, so he may have a little bit of public life. Now he is the interim chairman of the California Redistricting Commission. And I'm not sure that these individuals are quite going to be prepared for the publicity, the scrutiny, and the intense, involvement that the media is going to have in what they do in this commission.
And can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that it seems the reason voters have now twice really at the ballot box in recent years said this is what we want and expanded it this year, is the sense that, lawmakers, incumbents are really protecting themselves. I mean, how much of a difference can they really make, do you think? How different do you think those states are going to look in a year?
Most of the studies that have been done have suggested we're not going to see a huge increase in the number of competitive districts. Because if you think about it, San Francisco, for example, is pretty Democratic. You're not going to carve up San Francisco in, competitive districts between Republicans and Democrats with any ease, unless you got spokes going all the way out to Roseville.
Unless you have some really convoluted looking districts.
And that's really not the point. The point is to try to be compact, to try to preserve communities' interest. You also have to preserve minority groups. You're not allowed to, under the Voting Rights Act, the Federal Voting Rights Act, go in and split up those kinds of communities. So it's going to be a very difficult task that the Redistricting Commission has. They will almost certainly be challenged in court. So whatever they do, they have to do their best to make sure that it withstands the inevitable court challenges that will come.
Now, will they be challenged in court, or is it Prop 20? And explain how Prop 20 fits into this and whether that will be challenged in court.
Well, Prop 20 was the expansion of the congressional district responsibilities to this Redistricting Commission. Now, there has been some talk that there would be a challenge of the actual voters' decision to include the congressional districts. More likely, there will be a challenge of the maps themselves when they come out in August. And there will be groups that will say that these maps don't properly reflect the communities, that they violate the Voting Rights Act, that they disenfranchise minority groups, that there'll be any number of allegations that could be made about the maps.
And if these challenges are made, does everything get held up until those are settled?
Not necessarily. It depends on what a judge does, because we will have the elections that will go into effect in 2012. And there can't be too many delays in order for the folks who are now going to be living in new districts and up and down the state to prepare, and the election officials to prepare the new maps. This also triggers redistricting in many areas of the state that have county supervisor lines. The supervisors will be redrawing their lines. The BART districts, East Bay, all of the districts will all be redrawn based on this census data. So we're going to have a huge changeover in the boundaries, in this state between now and next summer.
Well, it's usual. California is never dull.
No.
And on that front, Josh, we can turn to you because one of the big controversies you mentioned earlier, you've been talking about this for 6 years, is prison overcrowding, and now the U.S. Supreme Court is in. Tell us about the court hearing.
Well, the court was hearing an appeal of a decision that was made by a 3-judge panel of federal judges that California absolutely has to downsize its prison population. The finding came after years and years, decades actually, of litigation, which said that the prisons are so overcrowded that they're unable to provide proper medical care and other care to inmates, and this is amounting to cruel and unusual punishment, unconstitutional treatment.
We're talking double overcrowding, right? Prisons that were designed for about 84,000 now have 160,000.
The 3-judge panel's order would reduce the prison population to 137% of capacity. That would be considered manageable. That's how far out of whack we are. We have about 150,000 inmates now, 148,000 give or take. And what we're looking at is a reduction of about 40,000. So the state is fighting this. They don't want to have to street these people necessarily. They have been looking at ways, the legislature and the governor have looked at ways to downsize. There was a bill signed into law relatively recently that allows for medical parole of certain prisoners who are so disabled that they can't possibly pose any threat to society. But we still have this massive problem, and that's what the justices are grappling with right now. And it seems from the arguments that they were not terribly swayed by the state's arguments that the status quo is acceptable, at least until they can come up with some other plan. They seemed inclined to uphold this 3-judge panel's decision. As usual, it looks like Justice Anthony Kennedy may be the swing vote. He said that it seems to be a perfectly reasonable decision that this 3-judge panel made, but He feels that perhaps that threshold, that 137% of capacity threshold, was somewhat arbitrary, and maybe that number can be monkeyed around with a little bit. But it seems like he and 4 other justices are definitely leaning towards saying this has got to stop. It's been 20 years already that the state has failed to deal with this problem, and something has to be done.
We're not the only state that has this problem. I understand there are like about 18 states that are all in this sort of together.
There are, but none on the scale of California's system. And we have this enormous prison system, this enormous prison health system, which has been in receivership for several years now at the order of a federal judge. And we're talking about billions of dollars in spending. I mean, it costs about $47,000 a year to maintain an inmate in the California prison system. Maintaining a sick inmate, depending on the sickness, can range many times that, up to $1 million a year, depending on...
Even if we let those sick inmates go, I assume they have no means of income. We'd still be paying for them as taxpayers, wouldn't we, if they send them home?
Very likely so, but it wouldn't be coming out of the prison budget, which is a section of the budget that has swelled enormously over the past few decades, and that voters seem to think is the section of the budget that they'd most like to be able to see cut.
And if I might jump in there,
yeah.
When this medical parole bill, one of the big arguments made for it among both Republicans and Democrats was that, yeah, well, if we parole them, they can get on Medicaid, and guess who pays for that? The federal government, or most of it. So it would be shuffling around the money, but
it's out of the state budget.
Exactly, right. and that's all people in Sacramento care about.
Makes me wonder, the $24 billion deficit in California coming up, how would this judge's ruling affect that? If suddenly the state has to shell out billions of dollars for what? For new prisons? I mean, I don't know what the solution would be.
Or for sending them out of state. Don't we have to pay for that when we send them out of state?
For sending them out of state, for the state has been arguing that it can build new prisons or increase capacity or improve care. The receivership, which this federal judge had put into effect years ago, has been there have been 2 receivers, actually. The first one, Bob Sillen, was a real go-getter and did not really care what the legislature had to say. He had a mandate from the federal courts, and he was going to solve it. That didn't win him a lot of friends in Sacramento. He got ousted. Now there's Clark Kelso, who's been tried to be more of a bridge builder, and yet he keeps coming forth with budget proposals that the legislature says, no can do. We don't have the money for it. The problem is this is a bill that California has had coming due for decades. We have never adequately funded prison health care, and we have a constitutional mandate to do so, and we can complain about it all we want, but in the end, somebody's got to pay the tab.
What's the new governor likely to do?
Well, the new governor may not have all that much to say about it because this has been out of the state's hands for some time in the federal receivership. And basically what the federal courts are saying now is this is what you must do. Attorney General Brown, Governor-elect Brown, has argued against this, as Governor Schwarzenegger had. They don't want to be put in the position of having to release 40,000 inmates of any kind for whatever political blowback that may have, whatever effect on public safety that may have. But honestly, if push comes to shove and the federal courts order this to be done, it's out of their hands, and they can always say, well, the federal courts made us do it.
And I think they may want that to happen because even Schwarzenegger, a Republican who has been pretty tough on a lot of public safety issues, has pushed more sort of, say, liberal things that the legislature they're not going to vote for. I mean, there's no reason for a lawmaker to put themselves out there because one guy gets out of prison early and that's the story, right? Yeah. But, I did a story recently about us sending folks out of state, and that's an interesting one, too, because they say, well, it's so much cheaper. Well, yeah, because they're only sending the people that have good behavior, don't have medical problems, are only going to be there for a certain amount of time.
The cheap people.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think to a certain extent, the judges are providing political cover for these guys.
And political cover is something they always look for, isn't it? Every time. There's never any shortage of that. Well, thank you all for being here with us today and for clearing up some of these issues. Well, thanks to his New Deal mural at Coit Tower, Bernard Zakheim was one of San Francisco's most famous artists and one of its most controversial. Now, an exhibit at the Fillmore's Jazz Heritage Center sheds new light on the art and life of this remarkable artist.
I think what's very distinctive about Zakheim is the way he captures the times. This is not art for art's sake. This is art as a political weapon.
Bernard Zakheim's most famous commission was the publicly funded New Deal art project at San Francisco's Coit Tower.
The Coit Tower mural project was the most controversial work of art in the city's history. 26 of the leading artists in San Francisco painted pictures of daily life in California. But 3 of the muralists, in the midst of all the class conflict of the 1930s, they painted scenes that the authorities thought were communist propaganda.
At the center of that controversy was Zakheim, the project's lead artist. His mural, The Library, would create a stir.
To him, the library was a place of gathering to learn and to study. His friend John Langley Howard very famously is standing on a ladder bringing down a copy of Das Kapital, but that's not the only book in the library. His idea was, why not this, why not that? Let's have Aristotle, let's have Hume, and why not read at least Das Kapital? You don't have to believe it, but why shouldn't you have a right to read it? This is his view.
Bernard Zakheim paid a very high price for his political convictions. He was very engaged in the world around him, often spoke out for civil rights and for class equality. And it hurt him during the Cold War and especially during the McCarthy period. Even though he was quite productive in the last 50 years of his life, he never again received the attention that he got in the 1930s, and thus we want now to bring him back. Our exhibit, The Art of Prophetic Justice, it's most appropriate that it be here in the Fillmore, because in the 1920s and 1930s, the artist's most productive years, he lived and worked in the Fillmore.
Zakheim created more than 1,500 works of art over his long life. He experimented with a broad range of styles and mediums, was a protege of Diego Rivera, a follower of the French post-impressionists, and like Marc Chagall, proudly referenced his Jewish heritage in many of his paintings. But until now, there has never been a major retrospective of his work.
Zakheim was especially shaken by the Holocaust because he immigrated to the United States from Poland, but almost all of the rest of his family stayed behind. He even went in the 1930s to warn them, but they did not heed that warning. He lost hundreds of relatives in the Holocaust. He began to depict the disaster in his paintings as early as 1944, even before the war was over.
In his later years, Zakheim moved to a farm in Sebastopol, infusing his paintings with themes of growth and rebirth, including this self-portrait.
He's holding an apple in his right hand, but he's not going to take a bite. He's holding it as though it were the Holy Grail, creating a sense, yes, this is life, and life itself is sacred.
Nathan Zakheim is Bernard's son. He and his son, Kuva, are both art preservationists by trade and helped curators pull the exhibit together, restoring many of the paintings in the process. Today, Nathan is hoping to rescue another piece of his father's legacy. He's brought Kuva to an abandoned medical building on the outskirts of San Francisco. Declared seismically unsafe, it will eventually be sold or face demolition.
Oh my goodness, there's a mural that's there. It's intact. I thought it might have been covered over completely. It's beautiful.
Painted in 1934 by Zakheim and his assistants, the mural portrays everyday life in the surrounding community. And like many other lesser-known New Deal murals, it could face being lost forever.
It's amazing. Very unusual. I've never seen a fresco that looked like this. You know, Kuva, it's sort of designed more like a watercolor.
The fresco is damaged, but in fairly good shape overall. But directly below it, they find something intriguing, the possible site of a long-lost Zakheim mural.
Big clue for me is that it's smooth.
They decide to painstakingly strip away layers of latex paint, hoping to reveal the hidden fresco without damaging it.
We're essentially flying blind because we don't know what's up here. But now we're getting down. Look what we're finding here. It's always exciting. This is what we came for.
It's a companion mural to the one above, and the artist's style is unmistakable.
Finding that picture was very dramatic, a very emotional thing for me today because I hadn't seen it ever, I think.
And now that they know the mural exists, they hope money can be raised for its full restoration.
I love working on my grandfather's work to actually reveal something that hasn't been seen since long before I was born, and now see it ready to be uncovered and seen by the world again. This is really amazing.
That really is amazing, fascinating. Well, Bernard Zakheim's paintings will be on display at the Fillmore's Jazz Heritage Center until December 11th. A companion photo exhibit will be up through December 30th. You can watch segments and episodes of our program by going to kqed.org/thisweek. You can share your thoughts about the show there as well. And tune in to KQED Public Radio's Forum program at 9 a.m. Monday for a preview of the Prop 8 arguments and then for live coverage of the federal court hearing on the case starting at 10 a.m. Thank you for watching This Week in Northern California. I'm Barbara Rogers sitting in tonight for Belva Davis. Good night.
Major funding for arts programming on This Week in Northern California is provided by Diane B. Wilsey. Additional funding provided by the George Frederick Jewett Foundation, Helen Sarah Steyer, and Fred Levin and Nancy Livingston of the Shenson Fund.